Up until the early 1870s, most ships of the Cunard fleet had either used side lever, geared beam, or vertical direct acting engines. In 1870, the Parthia became the first ever vessel in the Cunard fleet to be installed with a compound engine. Delivered in May of 1870, the Parthia was bought on the stocks from the William Denny and Brothers shipyard, located in Dumbarton, Scotland, and will become the very last ship in the company's fleet to be completed with a clipper bow and figurehead. The Abyssinia and the Algeria, the first of a new series of flush deck vessels, were also delivered in 1870, but instead were each powered by a two-cylinder vertical direct-acting engine. This pair of vessels not only had accommodation for a large number of immigrants, but they were also the first in the Cunard fleet with a straight stem. The main voyages of Abyssinia and Parthia both took place in May of 1870, and the Cunard Company was able to make a direct comparison between the performances of the two engine types. Parthia's coal consumption was found to be about half that of Abyssinia, and as a result, the decision was made to install compound engines on the Parthia, the latest addition to the Cunard fleet, which was already under construction at William Denny and Brothers. Just like her running mates, Abyssinia and Algeria, Parthia would feature flush decks, an open bridge design, 3 masts with barred rig sails, an iron hull, 8 lifeboats, and a single primary funnel. On the 2nd of February 1870, the keel of Parthia was laid down at the William Denny and Brothers shipyard in Dumbarton. Her passenger accommodation was originally built to accommodate 110 cabin and 850 steerage passengers. Parthia's final dimensions would come out to be slightly smaller than Abyssinia and Algeria, being 360.5 feet, a beam of 40.4 feet, and a gross tonnage of 3,431 tons. Parthia was built with a compound two-cylinder engine, which was also provided by the shipyard. This engine could do about 450 horsepower, providing the ship with a service speed of about 13 knots. As was the norm with vessels built during this time period, the engine connected to a single propeller shaft, and this propeller shaft in turn connected to a single 4-bladed screw propeller. Yard number 148 was launched on the 10th of September 1870 as the Parthia. Her fitting out was completed only a couple months later, her total construction cost coming out to £94,970. At her sea trials on the 30th of November 1870, Parthia averaged 13.2 knots. Parthia had been designed exclusively for the low-cost immigrant trade between Ireland and the United States, and was, as a result, built more for economy rather than speed and luxury. On the 12th of December 1870, Parthia was registered at Glasgow under the ownership of the British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, and less than a week later, on the 17th of December 1870, Parthia left on her maiden voyage from Liverpool to New York. Parthia would run both the New York and the Boston services for 13 years, sometimes calling at Boston when homeward bound from New York. A couple of notable events would occur during her service with the Cunard Company, including collisions, the first of which occurred on the 27th of February 1872, when Parthia collided with the British steamship Nina in the River Mersey. Nina then heeled over onto the Spanish steamship Emiliano, severely damaging the latter, which had to be beached as a result. In 1874, while departing New York, Parthia was involved in a collision with the White Star liner Adriatic, leaving Parthia with only slight damage. However, the fluke of the Parthia's starboard anchor drove through the Adriatic's quarter near enough to the waterline to require Adriatic to return to New York for repairs. On the 1st of July, 1878, Parthia was transferred to the Cunard Steamship Company Limited of Liverpool when the company was reorganized. In March of 1880, Parthia attempted to rescue a sailing ship, the 693-ton bark Mary A. Marshall, which was partly dismasted and waterlogged, to which Parthia took in tow for 36 hours. Unfortunately, the bark would later sink, but the crew was saved. In November of the same year, Parthia rescued the crew from another ship, the James Edwards, which foundered after losing her rudder in a gale. Parthia's third officer was commended for his work in rescuing the crew of 22 from the James Edwards. In 1881, Parthia went to war for the first time when she served as a troop ship for the British government in the Egyptian campaign during the Modest War. In 1882, Parthia ran aground outside New York Harbor to avoid a collision with the liner Saint Germain. On the 14th of November 1883, Parthia departed Liverpool for her final voyage from Liverpool to Queenstown and then heading towards Boston. In December of 1883, Parthia made her 119th and final Cunard crossing, where she traveled from Boston back to Liverpool for the very last time. Cunard then turned Parthia over to the shipbuilders, and on the 31st of December 1884, Parthia was registered under the ownership of John Elder and Company of Glasgow, having been sold along with the Parthia in part payment for Cunard's new express liners, the Umbria and the Etruria. In 1885, Parthia was re-engined with a new triple expansion engine, as well as new 150-pound pressure boilers. The new engine was a 4-cylinder triple expansion engine fitted by John Elder and could provide 500 horsepower. As a result of the new boilers and engines, this would reduce her daily coal consumption from 47 tons to only 25 tons. The new engine, as well as the new boilers, would continue to serve Parthia for the next 70 years. By the time the refit was completed that summer, Parthia was once again called into military service, being chartered once more for use in the Modest War. The newly formed Canadian Pacific Railway Company, established in 1881, took her over in 1887 and transferred her to the West Coast. From 1887 until 1891, she was chartered along with Abyssinia and Parthia for Canadian Pacific Railway's first Trans-Pacific services between Vancouver and the Far East. In 1891, Canadian Pacific introduced their famed clipper bow Empress liners, the Empress of Japan, the Empress of China, and the Empress of India, and as a result, no longer required Abyssinia, Parthia, and Parthia. Parthia was sent back to England for yet another overhaul. In June of 1888, Parthia was sold along with Parthia and Abyssinia to the Guion Steamship Company. Sir William Pierce, the owner of John Elder and Company, was also the chairman of the Cunard Line. In August of 1891, following the end of the Canadian Pacific Railway Charter, Parthia was returned to the Cunard Line. It was at this point Parthia was modernized by the Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering Company and given 2 pole masts. In May of 1892, Parthia was chartered once more, along with Parthia, which had now been renamed the Tacoma, to the Northern Pacific Steamship Company for a new Portland, Victoria Far East service. It was at this point that Parthia was now renamed the Victoria. The height of her funnel was also raised in the late 1890s. In October of 1898, Victoria was sold along with Tacoma to the North American Mail Steamship Company, where Victoria and Tacoma were both used on the same route. Between September of 1899 and March of 1900, Victoria was requisitioned as a U.S. transport during the Spanish-American War. She made 6 voyages during the War of Spain, and also a journey to Nome during the height of the Alaskan Gold Rush. She established her reputation as the gold ship by carrying thousands of gold seekers north and bringing out millions of dollars worth of gold bullion, often stacked in sacks on the deck of the purser's office for lack of room in the safe. In 1901, Victoria was sold to the Northern Pacific Steamship Company, the same company who chartered her in 1892. In February of 1904, Victoria was sold again, this time to the Northwestern Steamship Company, and placed on the Seattle to Alaska service, but also used on voyages to Siberia, where the owners had mining interests. Later, when war broke out between Japan and Russia, Victoria became a blockade runner in the Russo-Japanese War, assisting the port of Vladivostok in Russia. During her role, Victoria would be joined along the Olympia and Tacoma. The Tacoma, captured by Japanese warships, would end up becoming a prize of war, leaving only the Victoria unscathed come the end of the war. Eventually, the Guggenheim interests gained control of what was left of the Northwestern Fleet, and the Victoria became a full-time Alaska liner. A couple more incidents and mishaps occurred during this time period. In 1907, the Victoria struck an iceberg near Nome, filling her number 2 hold almost to the main deck, but her bulkheads held, and she made it to Seattle for repairs. Only 3 years later, she hit the beach at the foot of Hinchinbrook Island on the inside passage, but was refloated with no permanent damage. On the 1st of January 1908, the Northwestern Steamship Company merged with the Alaska Steamship Company to form the Alaska Steamship Company. The Black Ball flag was hoisted on the Victoria as part of the expanded fleet, and she was subsequently placed on the San Francisco-Seattle Nome service. Over the next couple of decades, Victoria would see 2 major refits. In 1912, Victoria was fitted with new oil-fired boilers. Around this time, her bridge deck was extended aft, and the ship's sea deck was also repainted white. The next of these refits came in 1924, when Victoria received an enclosed bridge, her bulwarks were extended forward, and the boat deck was plated in amidships. The passenger accommodation was also altered to accommodate the following: 163 first, 89 second, and 242 third-class passengers. While southbound in 1927, Victoria blew off a cylinder cover, and the U.S. Coast Guard cutter had to be dispatched and tow her into Akutan. In 1934, Victoria inaugurated the first Alaskan cruise for her owners, calling to both Nome and Kotzebue in Alaska. Victoria continued to sail as an Alaska passenger liner until 1937, when she was laid up in Lake Union in Seattle. At the end of that season, Victoria was retired, but not for long, as the world was about to enter another world war. In 1940, Victoria's passenger accommodation was removed, taking with it the former bridge deck that was once extended, was now removed to make room for cargo. The Victoria, now a cargo-only liner, was converted into a freighter for the United States War Shipping Administration. Victoria was painted navy gray and had guns mounted fore and aft. She returned to her old run, serving the northern outposts throughout the war, a war in which her old fleetmate Northwestern was bombed by Japanese planes at Dutch Harbor in Alaska. From 1941 to 1947, the U.S. War Administration used Victoria on a total of 46 voyages to Alaska. After the war ended, she was returned to her owners in 1947. From here, Victoria resumed service, making the northern freight runs during the peak of the summer season. In November of 1950, Victoria's bell was presented by the Alaska Steamship Company to the Cunard Steamship Company and installed on their new vessel, the 1948-built Parthia. When Victoria steamed south at the close of her last voyage in 1952, she was still a fine, trim ship. Her hull was reportedly as sturdy as it was back in 1870, and her engine, built by John Elder in 1885, was still smooth and powerful. She could still steam at 13 knots, and her crews loved her. Unfortunately, progress had finally caught up with the Victoria at last. The Alaska Steamship Company was shipping freight in U-unit-sized containers, and Victoria's small holds could not accommodate the big packages. The end of the Korean War also released modern coastal motor vessels that were much cheaper to operate. Victoria's days as a steamship were numbered. The Victoria made her last offshore voyage in the summer of 1952, and that August was laid up at Kirkland, Lake Washington, and Seattle. From 1908 to 1952, Victoria was under the ownership of the Alaska Steamship Company for 44 years, being the longest in service than any other company that operated her. In 1954, Victoria was sold to the Dolian Steel Products Company, who stripped out the engines and cut the superstructure right down to a barge. In 1955, Victoria was sold to Straits Towing Limited and renamed the Straits Number 27. Straits Number 27 would join the Straits towing fleet, which included a total of 36 steam and diesel tugs, as well as 65 barges, in a coastwise trade which extended from Alaska to Mexico. In August of 1956, the so-called Grand Old Lady made her last voyage on the Pacific Northwest Seaways. That same year, she was sold to Japanese shipbreakers and renamed the Straits Maru. She was registered at Osaka, Japan, and loaded with scrap iron, was towed from Victoria to Osaka by a Canadian tug, the Sudbury. Finally, on the 16th of October 1956, the former Parthia arrived in Osaka to be scrapped in Japan. With a service life spanning over 8 decades, in addition to participating in a total of 4 wars and conflicts, Parthia truly had an extraordinary career, and at 86, was the second longest surviving Cunard ship after the Hecla.